Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Corver. Today, we are joined by Alexandra Plakias. Alexandra Plakias is the Associate Professor of Philosophy at Hamilton College. Her research focuses on metaethics and moral psychology, the role of disgust in moral judgment, moral disagreement and objectivity, and the relevance of empirical psychology to metaethics. She also works on food and philosophy, which is the topic of today's discussion. Professor Plakias is the author of Thinking Through Food, which is an introduction to the ethics, epistemology, metaphysics, and aesthetics of food. You can find all the relevant links in the description of this video. I hope you enjoyed this episode. The Dare to Know podcast is now also available on Spotify and iTunes. Please check out the links in the description below. Professor Plakias, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So maybe to start off, could you just tell us a little bit more about your background, how you got interested in philosophy, but also more specifically in the philosophy of food?
Sure. So my research in philosophy mainly focuses in moral psychology. So when I was in graduate school, I was writing about moral disagreement, moral judgment, and also about disgust and the role that disgust plays in moral judgment. And that's really where my interest in food and in the philosophy of food started. I remember at the time that I was a graduate student, this idea of growing meat in a lab or creating meat in a lab was just starting to get media attention. And I remember seeing an article about it and thinking, wow, this is really interesting. Obviously, there's a lot of moral promise here. But at the same time, I did have a certain gut level aversion to it. And to be honest, I thought it's kind of icky, right? So I remember having this big debate with some of the graduate students in my department who were really committed vegetarians and were really excited about this from a moral point of view. And I really started wondering, well, could I justify refusing to eat something like this on the basis that it disgusts me? And that really got me thinking about how we classify things as food or not food, how we make our decisions about what to eat. On the one hand, it's a really personal choice, but it has all these far-reaching ethical implications. So coming at it from the angle of disgust and whether disgust could on its own justify a kind of decision about what to eat or not eat, that was really my entry point into the philosophy of food. And then when I got my job at Hamilton College, which is where I am now, it's a small liberal arts school, and they said, well, what courses would you like to teach? And I said, I'd love to teach a class on philosophy of food. The students were so excited about it. And I've taught that class pretty much every semester since I've been here now. So yeah, that's how it started.
No, that's awesome.
And I should say also, I've always been really interested in food too. I always worked in restaurants throughout high school and college, always, loved reading about food. I'm not a great cook, but I'm competent. So I always loved cooking too. So even before I got to the philosophy part of it, I was always interested in food.
No, that's awesome. And I think also in one of the earlier episodes, we've been talking with Professor Korsmaier, who also actually was thinking about food from the context of disgust, and then also how it relates to sort of deliciousness and disgust and how one can sort of spill over in the other. So that's also interesting to hear. And I think it's something we can discuss later in the conversation as well. So maybe sort of to sketch a bit of the context. So you also wrote a book yourself about the philosophy of food and sort of introducing both philosophy and food, which is titled Thinking Through Food, a philosophical introduction. So maybe you could just explain a bit more about how this book sort of came to be. Did it come sort of out of the courses you taught about philosophy of food, or what were your main motivations for sort of starting this book?
Yeah, absolutely. It came out of the class. Sometimes here in the US, you have like representatives from publishers who will come around to your office and say, what books are you using? Would you be interested in any of our books? And so they came by and they were asking what book I used in the philosophy of food class. And I said, well, I was telling them about various papers that I would use. There's a great anthology by David Kaplan of papers by philosophers on various topics related to food. But I said, I don't have an introductory book that I'm using. Most of the introductory books I was aware of at that point focused on food ethics. And they said, well, would you like to write a book? And I said, oh, I don't know. But, I really wanted to write a book about philosophy of food that covered not just ethics and not just aesthetics or politics, but the epistemology and metaphysics of food as well, because I feel like food is a really interesting thing to consider in those contexts. It can tell us, there's a lot of overlap in those fields. And I felt like there wasn't really a book that was aimed at introductory level students that covered those topics. Now, what I did not know at the time was that David Kaplan was also working on a book on this. And so his book Food Philosophy came out in 2020, and also has kind of a similar organization where he has some great chapters on food epistemology and food metaphysics. And it's really interesting because even though the project superficially seems similar, just to give a sense of what a rich topic food is, the way that we come at these discussions about food epistemology is really different. And so I think that just shows that those areas of metaphysics and epistemology of food are really fruitful, and there's a lot of exploration to be done there.
No, certainly. And so for the listener, you reading both books is required to get the bigger picture.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's really helpful. And then sort of like in the beginning of your book, you start by sort of, okay, how do we define this notion of food, right? And that might sound like an easy task for a lot of people. Look it up in the dictionary and you have your answer, but that isn't really the case. So how do we sort of approach this idea of, okay, how do we define food? And you also tell us, okay, that brings us immediately into the area of metaphysics of food. How should we approach that question?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it's an important one. And it's really interesting when you start to look up, well, okay, how would I define food? How do regulatory bodies define food, right? Like, what is food in a technical sense? And the answer is pretty much, it's whatever you eat and think is food, right? So in some sense, it really is up to us how to define food. And that's a decision with big consequences, right? And one thing that we're seeing now, at least in the US, that I think is really interesting is a lot of legal and regulatory battles over not necessarily the term food, but terms like milk or cheese, right? As plant-based products like oat milk or soy milk become more popular, this question of what counts as milk is a question with a lot at stake, both environmentally and financially. So there's a lot of court battles over who gets to call something milk, who gets to call something meat, what counts as a burger, right? And these are really, I think, significant questions. The question of what counts as food more broadly also is going to have huge practical implications, right? As we see more and more, versions of meat. I guess, I did a panel recently with some people who, from a person whose company is cultivating seafood in laboratories. And it turns out they really don't like the term lab-grown meat. So I was about to say lab-grown meat, and then now I catch myself. They prefer cultivated meat. Even there, you can see how classification and terminology is so important to people, right? But in thinking about why we in America don't eat insects, for example, which would be a really sustainable, healthy source of protein compared to, say, beef, right? One answer is that we don't think that insects are food typically. If you find an insect in your food, you think it's a contaminant, it's out of place, right? We don't view them as food. And so thinking about what counts as food to us, right, is, I think, a really significant question. And I think that it's something that we kind of take for granted, that there are things that are food and there are things that aren't. And we treat the category of food as something that's given to us rather than as something that we, through our choices, are actively constructing, right? So if you look at, my son is 4 and he's obsessed with gummy anything, right? Any kind of gummy candy. You look at a piece of gummy candy, it's not obviously food, right? There are many things about it that would seem very non-food-like, right? Or take, gummy vitamins, which are another thing that are very popular, right? Is that food? Well, it's not obvious one way or the other, but I think we rely really heavily on context. Like, it's in a grocery store, it's in the aisle next to food, it must be food. And I think, it would benefit us to develop a much more critical attitude about what we think of as food and why.
And I think in this context, you also sort of encourage us, I guess, or it seems to me that you sort of encourage us to then come up with sort of a definition of food that does accommodate sort of a plurality of value. So if we sort of take a first step into how do we define food, to me, sometimes it seems that, okay, we need to have some sort of social conception of food, right? And then when you dig deeper into sort of what that social conception is, then you get maybe through, a variety of different values that can sort of be embodied through that conception. But you do think, okay, this plurality should play an important role when we think about these questions sort of in the context of defining these things. Why is that?
Well, I think that we can't, in defining food, I mean, one thing we can do is look at the substance itself and what's in it and what are its components, right? We can talk about it from a nutritional point of view. What is it, does it give us energy, for example? But food also plays a huge social and cultural role too. And so I think to leave that out would be a mistake, right? And we have to acknowledge that food is more than just something we ingest for sustenance. In fact, I would say most of the food we eat is not really just to sustain us. It's because it has a social and emotional, a cultural component.
And would it be right that maybe the naive view would be, okay, there's food, okay, we can eat it, instead of, if you think about it, it's like, no, actually, you have an interesting quote maybe that actually illustrates this point. You say, we don't eat certain things because they're food, rather they're food because we eat them. So
Absolutely.
the naive view might actually lean more towards the first sort of part of that sort of quote, and sort of the social conception that sort of opens up this field is more leaning towards the second part, which sort of says, like, hold on, like, it's not that it's just laying there food and we'll eat it. It's like, no, we actually make it, and it is sort of this social construction.
Absolutely, right. I mean, there's plenty of things we could eat that would sustain us fine that we don't think of as food, right? Like our pets or our family members, but and then there are plenty of things that we eat that may not really have much nutritional value at all, right? And so I think that is a very important insight, that every time we sit down to eat, we are in a sense defining food for ourselves, right? And defining food for those around us. So it's a choice that we actively make with every meal. Not to put too high stakes on it, not to load it up too much.
And one thing also, the more I think about it, it also seems to be that as soon as you sort of, let's say, approach this metaphysical question, right? Like, what is food? It sort of almost automatically lets you enter into these other fields, such as, for example, ethics, what you just mentioned, right? Like, okay, is our pet food, right? So that's just one thing that the more I read about sort of the philosophy of food, the more it really seems to be very quickly interrelated, where one question in metaphysics can lead you to a question in ethics. And when I was talking to Lisa Heltke, actually she ends her chapter at one point on metaphysics and connects it back sort of to the ethics dimension. So that's just one thing I've been noticing. I'm not sure if you sort of see that as well, where it's very sort of intuitive that one leads you to the other in food, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in thinking about the ethics of what we eat, for example, one approach to thinking about questions involving eating animals would be to say, look, animals are not food. If you don't think that your pet is food, you shouldn't think that a cow is food, for example, or a pig is food or something like that, right? So I think one approach is to say, well, yeah, these are kinds of food we shouldn't eat, right? Another approach would be to say, we shouldn't even conceptualize these things as food, right?
No, that's very interesting. And sort of maybe also moving to the topic of flavor. So we also had Charles Spence on the podcast, talking a lot about, the important distinction between, for example, taste and flavor. And you also sort of take a philosophical angle on, okay, how should we understand this, notion of flavor? And you actually introduce sort of a famous philosophical argument from Frank Jackson called the Mary argument, in order sort of to further clarify, okay, what do we really mean when we sort of trying to say what flavors really are?
Right. So Frank Jackson has this case that he describes as a thought experiment, where he asks us to imagine, someone named Mary, who is this brilliant color scientist. So she knows all the physical facts about color. She's read every book. She knows everything there is to know about the physical science of color. But she's been raised since birth in a black and white room. So she's never seen colors. She's never experienced color firsthand. And Jackson says, okay, now imagine that after knowing all these physical facts, Mary is released from her room and she encounters a red apple for the first time. Does she learn something new? And Jackson thinks it's just obvious, yes, that we would say Mary now knows something she didn't know before about color. She's learned something new by experiencing a red apple. And if that's true, he says, the physical facts aren't all there is to color. There's something over and above it, some experiential aspect. So when I was writing the book, I was thinking, that you could run a similar argument involving taste, right? So I use the case of Chloe, who is a scientist who knows everything there is to know about flavor, and she knows all the physical facts about flavor. And then, but she's been raised since birth on a relatively flavorless diet, say Soylent or one of these, meal substitutes. And then she tastes chocolate for the first time. And we would certainly, it seems to me, want to say she learned something new about flavor, right? By experiencing chocolate for the first time. Now, I should say, after I put this in the book, I came across a paper by Aaron Meskin and John Robson on, I think, aesthetic testimony and food. And they use a similar example, a version of Frank Jackson's Mary argument. So what I was trying to show with the art, I think they use it in a slightly different way, though, I should clarify. What I was trying to show is that, look, there's more to flavor than just physical descriptions or facts. And I think flavor is an interesting case when we think about certain kinds of aesthetic properties, because, we can tell from the fact that flavor is, a multi-billion-dollar industry, that we can reduce flavor in some sense to physical components, right? When scientists are trying to come up with a dish, when they want to create, vanilla flavor or banana flavor or grape flavor, or, now they're just, really much more complex ones, capturing the flavor and the experience of a burger in something made of plants, right? They can do that, and they can do it fairly predictably, right? If you couldn't reliably construct flavor out of physical, molecules, then the food industry wouldn't be nearly as successful as it is. And we can predict, what it's going to taste like to lots of different people, right? It's not like, what you get when you go into McDonald's will vary wildly person to person. It's a very predictable flavor profile, right? And so that, I think, might tempt us to think that flavor is straightforwardly reducible to certain physical properties. But I think that arguments like Jackson's kind of challenge that assumption a little bit by showing, well, look, there is a kind of experiential component to things like flavors, where if you've never tasted something, can you really know what it tastes like, right? And, this is relevant not just in thinking about flavor itself, but in thinking about food criticism, the way we read about food online, especially now, right? When, food blogging is a huge thing. I'm not on TikTok, but I hear that food TikTok is really big and you can get great cooking tips. But, there's a lot of foods out there that, try as I might, I won't ever have the chance to encounter or experience firsthand. Can I really know what they taste like by reading a description of them, right? Or by, reading about the flavor of those foods or something like that. And so that's an interesting question too.
And so, but is it also one of these sort of conclusions that comes out of sort of this Mary argument, specifically sort of applied to flavor, that there is also sort of this subjective experience that is untouchable, that is sort of at the core for you as a subject, that is not necessarily criticizable from another perspective? Like, does it sort of leave that type of like a nucleus as sort of the subjective experience when we think about flavor that isn't necessarily, for example, describable? Does that play also like a real sort of a practical role? Although you do say, okay, there is this huge convergence, right? I mean, that's why there's these markers. Like on the other, like while that can be accepted, we can also accept, it seems to me, like the subjective experience that is solely attached to you as a subject, right? That sort of at least provides sort of an experiential realm for an individual to think about flavor. Would you agree with that?
I think there is always going to be some subjective element to it. Sure. Yeah. I think what's interesting in the case of flavor is that we can also explain certain subjective differences by pointing to physiological differences, right? So cilantro is like famously polarizing. There are a lot of cilantro haters out there. And this isn't just an inexplicable subjective difference, right? It turns out there are genetic differences that will make cilantro taste one way to certain people and another way to others. Right? You can, there are so-called super tasters who are much more sensitive to bitter tastes. And so certain foods will be less palatable to those people than to others. The question, can I ever really know what it tastes like to someone else? Maybe not, right? But we can certainly predict people's food preferences and likes and dislikes by looking at certain physiological by looking at certain physiological facts about them. Yeah. I think another thing that's interesting in the case of food description is the question of whether acquiring a richer descriptive vocabulary can actually change how you experience food, right? So people who taste wines, for example, and are trained with a certain set of descriptors, right? It seems that they would actually start to experience the taste of wine differently, right? That they will be able to pick out more nuances, or at least point to more nuances in those flavors in a way that an untrained person might not be able to. And the question is, well, are those differences really there and they're detecting them, or are they just sort of describing differences because they've now acquired this different vocabulary that kind of primes them to expect those differences?
And are we supposed to understand that sort of like how sort of the, let's say, the sense of taste interacts with like our linguistic abilities, in that sense, like expanding our vocabulary? Does that also give us richer insight into our sense of taste? So it is really like that interaction between one ability and sort of the senses. Is that like a way of conceptualizing? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And, another thing is that we are very good at perceiving things about our environment that we may not even be aware we're doing. So I don't know if Charles Spence might have talked about this. I do this in my food class a lot. There's an experiment you can do where you play someone the sound of a hot liquid pouring and the sound of a cold liquid pouring. And when I tell my students we're going to do this, they kind of look at me like, what are you talking about? They're really, really good. And it turns out everyone is really good at telling the difference between the sound of a hot liquid being poured and a cold liquid being poured. Almost nobody thinks in advance, like, oh yeah, I could definitely do that, right? But it turns out that we're really good at detecting this subtle difference, right? And so, yeah, so we may know more about food, or more about, we may be getting more information from food than we're really aware of.
That's also like interesting. So that would be sort of unconscious, like we have that knowledge, but we're not necessarily like actively thinking about it. But there are these things that we pick up on regarding information that we might not be even aware of, but that is actually the case. That actually reminds me also with the discussion with Professor Borghini when he talks about recipes and the either sort of recognizing certain affordances in the dish that might again be sort of picking up on knowledge that's sort of hidden in the dish, how we should eat it, for example, but nonetheless not necessarily consciously being aware, okay, this is step 1, 2, 3, this is how we eat it. That would be similar, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
No, that's really interesting. And when we sort of move to the topic of food labeling, a topic that we haven't really discussed yet, you sort of connect that topic specifically with thinking about sort of the epistemology of food. So maybe just introduce, how should we be sort of conceiving of this topic, like the epistemology of food, and then how does that help us address questions related to food labeling?
Right. So I think the epistemology of food is a super interesting area. I think there's a lot of important and interesting questions there. One, as you said, has to do with food labeling, right? Just at a very basic level, how do we know what we're eating, right? I mean, as we saw, even knowing what counts as food or not is something we kind of take for granted, but it's not at all obvious what counts as food or not food, right? And then this question of, well, when I go to the store and I buy something, how do I actually know what I'm eating, right? How do I know that this is applesauce? How do I know, that this is salmon, right? I mean, one thing we know is that, in fact, one thing I can say is that, in fact, you don't know that a lot of the time, right? Up to 50% of fish is mislabeled by species, right? There was a big scandal when I was living in the UK, I guess like almost 10 years ago, where a lot of frozen food products were labeled as containing ground beef, but it turned out to be horse meat, right? And so there are these questions, olive oil, for example, is a famously adulterated, mislabeled product. So there's a lot of adulteration, a lot of mislabeling, a lot of outright fraud in the food system. There's a case right now in the US where someone is suing Subway, the sandwich chain, saying that their tuna isn't tuna, it's something else. So it turns out to be really hard to figure out at a basic level, like what you're eating. And yet that's something I think most of us take for granted. And what that shows is that we are pretty vulnerable as eaters. We're forced to trust the food system, but the food system isn't really very trustworthy, right? And so I think one question in food epistemology is just this question that's kind of basic to all epistemology, right? How do we know? How do we know anything about the world around us, the food world around us, right? We're very reliant on labels, but when you look at the terms on labels, often they don't mean much, or they're fairly indecipherable to us, right? And here I have in mind ingredients lists, right? Like the actual names of ingredients are often fairly indecipherable, but also the claims that labels make are often either meaningless or misleading. And so I think as knowers, we are pretty vulnerable when it comes to our knowledge about what we're eating. And then there's a whole set of issues related to the kinds of advice we're given about what to eat, and the advice we get from nutrition experts and things like that. about what we should be eating and the health claims that are given to us about food.
Mm-hmm. And you also sort of introduced the idea, I guess, that the label is sort of providing a testimony to us. So I guess that's also a big thing in epistemology, talking about a testimony. Also, like, how should we be thinking about a label sort of providing testimony to us, and how we should, what we can get from those sort of testimonies?
Right, that's a good question. I mean, one issue is, in cases of testimony, we often think, well, there's an act of trust that comes along with, thinking that we know something based on testimony.
Yeah.
But I think by now probably realize that food labels are not very trustworthy in one sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so one question is, does that mean that we really can't know anything based on labels? This gets to more general questions about how much additional justification you need to believe something based on testimony, right? Do you need more than, do you need sort of extra reason to think that it's particularly trustworthy? And if so, then we might really not know very much based on food labeling. Likewise, I think something we're less focused on, but that the American writer Marion Nestle has done a lot of work on, is whether food experts themselves are trustworthy, right? We know that a lot of studies on nutrition historically have been funded by food lobbies or food corporations, right? So the question of how much we can trust even the nutrition advice that we see, or claims on labels to be heart healthy or things like this, is, I think, questionable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, and this, I guess, like, maybe introducing one notion that we also discussed in previous episode, like the idea of sort of authority, right? Like one question is maybe a central notion would be like trust, right? Like, would we trust? But then also sort of who has the authority to make certain claims that then relate to how we trust it, I guess. So you already mentioned, I mean, the sort of lobbyists sort of sponsoring specific research, right? Which might raise some doubt about sort of trusting those type of results, but then maybe sort of regulatory frameworks, right? Between, let's say, European Union or whatever that get made, right? Like, there should be sort of some sort of prioritization or hierarchy of where trust lies, right? And who has the authority to make sort of these rules up, right? That we then should trust. But in general, you seem to say, if I'm like interpreting correctly, that we should be skeptical in many cases about the claims that do get made, because often they seem to not really be in line with the truth, I guess.
There's this really interesting book that I think Andrea Borghini might have been one of the people who mentioned it to me, and I can't remember the author's last name, but it's called Nutritionism. And this is an idea that Michael Pollan refers to. Did this come up in your podcast episode with him?
Not yet. This is new.
Okay. So it's this idea that the way we approach food is by thinking about breaking it down into constituent ingredients, right? Mm-hmm. And this, I think, Michael Pollan talks about this a little bit in some of his work, and I didn't realize that he actually got the idea from this other author. The book is called Nutritionism. It's great. And as I said, his argument is the philosophy of nutritionism is essentially the idea that food can be broken down into different constituent parts, like carbohydrates, proteins, calories, right? The idea that we can evaluate food in this kind of very scientific way as consisting of all these different elements. This, I think, really summarizes our food epistemology very nicely. And I think if you think about it, it's very industry friendly in the sense that it makes it very easy to isolate a specific component of food, do a study using that component, see if you get any kind of result, and then make a claim about the food as a whole, right? So you show, well, certain kinds of whole grains seem to have a certain effect on, blood sugar levels or on cholesterol levels, right? Okay, so we took that constituent part out. Now we can then put it back into this cereal, which might also contain lots of sugar, lots of other things, and say, well, it has this one component, so it's going to have this overall effect on health or diet or something like that, right? Which is a kind of shady way to think about it, right? I mean, the fact that pulling out one ingredient and this ingredient is shown to have a certain effect in isolation and then putting it back into the food and making the claim about the food as a whole, from an epistemic perspective, that doesn't seem very well founded. I think, moreover, though, it shows us something about the way we think of as foods is that they're kind of these interchangeable parts, right? And this is, I think, largely how we think of our attitude towards health, right? You just have to measure certain nutrients. They're all interchangeable no matter what source you get them from, right? You can put the vitamin D back into cereal. You can put, now it's protein is like a really popular one, right? So, my kids' chocolate chip granola bars have protein in them. Great. Okay, no problem, right? But, certainly that's a relatively new way of thinking about food. And you might think, well, there's a lot that it doesn't capture about, the social and cultural significance of food, but also there's a lot we don't know about nutrition and the way that, nutrients might work together, or that, whole foods might work in a way that processed foods might not. And one thing that people have, that studies have shown is that the more processing a food has been subject to, the more nutrition claims you're likely to find on the label, right? And so there seems to be this relationship between this kind of nutritionistic approach to food and the amount of processed food that we're exposed to in the grocery store, in our daily lives, and things like that.
And maybe me, at least my first impression sort of listening to this would be, when we sort of create these constituents, like one advantage of that, like from an individual perspective, I guess, like sort of epistemologically speaking, would be, okay, now we're sort of simplifying and creating a current sort of like currency, right, that we can sort of exchange, and okay, this sort of comes in from a nutritional standpoint and I can apply it there. So in some sense, because as you mentioned, right, there's so much information there, like how are you going to, as an individual, sort of approach that, like creating some sort of common currency, at least to, relate things to each other, is sort of, it seems to be like sort of a helpful strategy. But like ultimately, do you think that is a good strategy, trying to work towards this current currency? Because there also comes the risk that you are oversimplifying the actual holistic picture of how you should evaluate food.
Right. I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. And I think the way you've just explained it really highlights one problem with it, which is that it makes us very dependent and very vulnerable to these kinds of claims, right? I said before, we don't really know what we're eating a lot of the time. And I think that's true. But on the other hand, if you think about cases where it just seems obvious that we do know what we're eating, right? I know if this is a banana. I know if this is an apple. I know if this is spinach, right? I don't know if this granola bar has high levels of omega-3 fatty acids, right? I just don't know that. And so the more we move towards that nutritionist paradigm, or that kind of, currency model, as you put it, the more vulnerable and dependent we are on these claims that are being made. And I think also the more we're liable to be confused by this sort of constantly changing landscape of dietary advice that we're given, right? There's a great book by a journalist called Michael Moss, who's written a couple of books about the food industry, and his latest one is Hooked. And one thing he points out is that as the food industry has moved towards more and more highly processed food as a source of profit, it's also simultaneously the same companies that are selling this food have been buying up like weight loss companies and diet companies, right? So there's a sense in which we're very dependent and very vulnerable to guidance from others, because we live in a very confusing food environment, right? The claims that are being made are very confusing. And, it would be easy to sit here and say, well, the solution is to just eat what you know. I mean, this is like Michael Pollan's line, right? Don't eat anything your grandmother, or in our case, probably your great grandmother, wouldn't recognize as food. Okay, that's great advice. But guess what? I live in upstate New York. There's feet of snow on the ground 6 months of the year, right? I mean, that's just not practical advice for most people. So I think, we need to recognize that we are susceptible to a kind of manipulation. There's a really interesting area of study called agnotology, which is the study of ignorance. And one of the key insights of agnotology is that, and this I think comes up also, and you see it in philosophers like Charles Mills, ignorance is not just something that happens where you don't have knowledge yet, right? It is a naturally occurring phenomenon, but it can also be a manufactured phenomenon, right? And one of the canonical examples is tobacco companies in the 1970s and 80s, as people are starting to document a link between cigarettes and cancer, creating doubt, right? Funding studies that would raise doubts about the link between cigarette smoke and cancer, literally manufacturing a kind of ignorance. When you can manufacture doubt, you get the lack of knowledge, right? Raising doubts can destroy knowledge. And, I would say, oh, look, isn't it interesting that the food companies are doing the same thing, right? When Coca-Cola says, oh, you need to move more in order to, have a healthier lifestyle, right? They're creating doubt about the link between food consumption or soda consumption and health, right? It's not a coincidence because the same corporations moved out of the tobacco industry and into the processed food industry. So it's literally the same playbook, right? But there's this way in which we are, the confusion that we feel about what to eat and about the link between certain foods and health, that's not just a kind of coincidence. That's not just confusion that is coming from us. That is confusion that is deliberately manufactured so that we do not know what to eat. And if we don't know what to eat, then someone else can come in and tell us.
That's interesting, how these pieces move together. And then maybe now is also a good time to sort of introduce a distinction, I think, that is also sort of applicable to this discussion. Namely, on the one hand, you talk about lying and deception. So when people talk about advertisement, that's one whole topic, I guess, that people discuss, right? Like how that sort of worked into maybe this area of advertisement, or where some people claim that any form of advertisement is sort of per definition playing around with these terms, I guess. But you also introduce the subtle notion of bullshit. So maybe you could just help us see like what sort of work that notion is helping us sort of do in this sort of discussion.
Right. So the key distinction between lying and bullshit is that bullshit doesn't have to be false, right? A claim that's bullshit could be true, could be false, but this comes from Harry Frankfurt's famous essay on bullshit, right? He says, look, the bullshitter just isn't in the business of truth or falsity. They're engaged in some totally different enterprise altogether, right? And I think when we look at food labels, we see this a lot, right? We see so much bullshit. One of my favorite examples is just a phrase you see a lot, 100% real ingredients. Like this was even, I was making myself a cup of tea right before we started. And I turned the tea bag over and it said, made with real ingredients. I mean, no one is walking around worried that their tea is made with imaginary tea leaves, right? So this is a completely meaningless claim, but it feels meaningful, right? It does, this idea of, another word we see a lot is pure, right? Natural, things like this, which, at the moment, natural has no real regulated meaning. A few years ago, the Food and Drug Administration said, we really need to figure out what natural means. And they asked people to send in suggestions. Basically, they solicited public comments. So they should be coming out with, some guidance soon. But at the moment, those are fairly meaningless terms, right? Real, pure, natural. The problem is that when we see them on a label, whether we're consciously aware of it or not, it feels like they mean something, right? And so it gives us this sense that we're buying something that we may not be, right? At a more specific level, before I mentioned, putting whole grains on a label or something like that. I mean, on the one hand, that does mean something, right? It tells you something about what's in there, but it's also being used to convey a kind of sense of health that may be completely, off base, right? When I see, whole grains on like frosted mini wheat cereal or something like that, it's, it may not be strictly speaking false, but it's a kind of bullshit in the sense that it's trying to get me to think like, this is a healthy choice, right? This is a healthy cereal. This cereal will have health benefits. And that's simply not true, right? We also see this a lot when it comes to, people making an effort to eat more ethical food products, right? There's a sense in which some of these labels like cage-free they do mean something, right? But often they don't mean what we think they mean. And if we look at cage-free eggs and think, oh, I'm making a much more humane choice here, that just may not be the case, right? So there's, the proliferation of some of these terms and the lack of transparency about what they mean, I think contributes to an environment where we're very vulnerable to thinking that we have more information than we do.
And so when I think a bit more about sort of this notion of bullshit, right, where like they're not aiming even, anymore at sort of some idea of truth or, how it at least relates to truth. Like I was also thinking like that also sort of, I mean, because then we're sort of interpreting their intention, right? Like what they are sort of trying to convey from sort of an information
Right.
perspective, which is like maybe doable, but like I was just thinking, like, are we sort of also not giving them an easy path, like, oh no, they're not even aiming at truth, or like confronting them more and saying, no, they are aiming at truth, but maybe they have a more expensive notion where they say it's not just some sort of descriptive fact, but it also sort of is about like the values and right, like the experience that our customers should have. And sure, we cannot pinpoint it down what pure means, but that's in the experiential realm. I'm not saying that is the case. I'm just saying, right, like, are we giving them a free pass when we say, oh no, they're not even aiming at food? Like, yeah.
Oh yeah, so just saying that it's bullshit kind of let them off the hook,
Yes.
because like, then you can't really say like, look, this isn't pure. And they're like, but pure doesn't mean like anything literal. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I think that is an interesting question, and that might apply more towards things like pure or real ingredients, where you'd say like, sure, everyone knows that, right? I mean, yeah, I think you're right. That might be one thing to worry about in calling it bullshit, but even in thinking about the imagery on food packages and things like that, I don't think that we should say that. I think that manipulation can be in its own way as deceptive as an outright lie, right? And part of the problem is that there's this appearance of getting information where there's no actual information to be had, right? It's like the difference, like, if you think of like diet soda, right? It's trying to convey that there's like substance there and there's no actual substance. Bullshit is like the diet soda of labeling claims, right? You feel like you're getting something, but there's no actual substance there. And so the problem is we walk away thinking we know more about our food than we do. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting. And maybe, so, we've been sort of talking a lot about these difficulties, right, from sort of a epistemological perspective, right? How are we going to be dealing, processing this information, making decisions? And it seems like quite a maze to me to sort of navigate this. But you do say there is sort of a promising approach from your perspective if we look at epistemology, namely you talk about, virtue epistemology specifically. So, I mean, we now sort of have a picture of all these challenges that exist from sort of an epistemological perspective. How is virtue epistemology going to allow us to sort of navigate this?
Right. So I think that, I've also been very focused on this from a consumer point of view. And I think when I was writing the book, I was thinking, well, part of the problem here is that maybe our model of taking a certain number of pieces of evidence, using those as your justification, forming a belief, then assessing that belief in terms of truth or falsity, sort of this very, standard S knows that P model of epistemology, maybe that's just not very well suited to thinking about how we interact with food. And maybe instead we should think of food epistemology as involving a kind of set of skills, and that the successful eater, the eater who really knows what she is doing, is going to be one who has developed the skills necessary to navigate our food environment. And, that involves not just being able to read labels, of course, but also kind of just listening to, being attuned to flavor, being attuned to food preparation, being attuned to recipes, being attuned to knowing what to eat when, right? There's a great study, this was done in like the 1920s. You could never do this study today. There's a really interesting study, though, done by a social worker in Chicago. Her name is Clara something. I can't remember the last name. She did this study with all these babies, right? Where she would basically bring in the babies, but she would just every day put out like a ton of different foods, like cod liver oil, like raw liver, orange juice, fruit, and just let the babies eat whatever they wanted. And like if they were too small to eat, they would kind of like gesture at the food and she would give it to them, right? And what she found was that like what they were eating, like just some kids would just, drink cod liver oil every day and, for a few days and then switch. And so she, it seemed like these kids were picking out different things to eat, and ending up with like pretty well balanced diets, basically, was the upshot. So, if you give people a variety of foods and let them choose what to eat. Now, am I saying like, oh, this is a study from which we can draw very robust scientific conclusions? No. But what I am saying is that, from a young age, we have opinions about what we want to eat, and we're guided partly by flavor and partly by our body's desires to eat certain foods, right? Yeah. And so I think part of food epistemology too is just being, attuned to our own needs, whether that be a social need, an emotional need, a cultural need, and not forgetting that like we are part of this too, right? As individuals, and everyone's going to have different dietary needs and desires and things like that. And I think the role that flavor plays in deciding what to eat and in food epistemology is a really interesting one, right? The flavors that we're presented with now are pretty highly manipulated and pretty highly designed. And, so even just learning in certain cases what something tastes like can be a kind of exercise of skill, right? I know when I was growing up, I would have like grape soda or grape jelly. And I was always really confused because I'd be like, grape, like you would get grapes at the store and then you would get grape jelly. And I was like, why is this flavor is so far off base, right? This is not what grape tastes like. And then when I moved here a few years ago, I went to the farmer's market and bought Concord grapes. I don't know if you've ever had a Concord grape. If you do, you will immediately be like, oh, that's what the grape flavor is. It's Concord grape flavor, but it's a kind of grape that most people never buy in the supermarket anymore, right? So in some ways, like we forgot what a certain kind of grape tastes like, right? And we just don't know that. That knowledge has been lost, right? So where was I going with this? Oh, because you asked me about virtue epistemology.
Yes,
so
yes.
let me say a couple of things, because I first want to say that a lot of what I've said is probably coming across as this kind of very anti-processed food mentality. And I do think that there are big problems with the food industry, big problems with processed food. And so I'm that's true. And if I came off with that way, that's not entirely wrong. But I don't think that processed food is always bad. Processed food is a lifesaver in many instances. We have to feed an increasingly populated planet. Processing is one way of doing that. And there's a great piece called In Defense of Culinary Modernism by a woman named Rachel Loudon, where she talks about like, you do not want to go back to the days of yore when it comes to food, because making food then was a full-time job, right? And who did that job? Mostly women. Right. So it's not a coincidence that we see the rise of processed foods as women move out into the workforce. Right. So I just want to say that I'm not, I don't want to make it seem like I think we should just give up on processed food. My one reservation looking back about some of the comments I make about virtue epistemology in the book is that it puts a lot of burden on eaters. Right. It puts a lot of the epistemic burden on us as individuals, as consumers. And I think that is a problematic trend, not just in the case of food, but, across the board, to put the burden on consumers to recycle their plastics, to make more sustainable choices, to reduce their consumption, right? And in this case, to figure out what they're eating. That's a lot of work, right? Choosing unprocessed foods is a lot of work, not just in terms of preparing them, but even just in terms of buying them, right? When we talk about food deserts, we often think of urban environments. But where I live in rural upstate New York, you can live in areas easily where it's a 40-minute drive from the nearest supermarket. If you do that to buy fresh vegetables, well, guess what? Fresh vegetables are going to take up more room in your fridge. They're not going to last as long, right? And so then you have to do that drive more often. And a lot of people just don't have time to do that, right? Or their work schedules don't permit it. Or up here, there are people who are too elderly to drive or who can't drive because, of various reasons. So I want to acknowledge that there are real limitations on people's ability to access fresh or unprocessed food. And so, to have epistemic virtues that enable you to make certain food choices is great. But if you can't actually follow through on those choices or act based on those choices or access those foods, then that's not really going to make a practical difference in your life. So I think virtue epistemology is promising up to a point, but we can't rely on, and it's not fair to put the burden on consumers themselves entirely. What we need are better and tougher regulatory actions to make that information more transparent to consumers.
No, that's very helpful. And so I think it depends how we want to sort of frame the question. So from an individual perspective, you could still make the case for which I think I like, where you do sort of vouch for a more active approach, right, of the individual. When you say, okay, let's pay more attention. We might be forgetting that, we're not doing that anymore, right? But there's a lot of information that we can grasp as an individual, and that would maybe go against a trend where it's just consuming, it's just this passive role, and the big corporations or will just push the food and just eat it and don't think about it. This is a much more active role. But then you also say, okay, there are these limitations from sort of an institutional perspective, right, where that framework sort of collapses. Not that it becomes, useless, but there's limitations for how we want to evaluate this, and just two distinct questions that we have to answer. No, I think that's very helpful.
And the last thing I'll just say on this is that we, I think, need to start thinking about how we teach children about food, and not, there's a lot of focus, at least in this country, and I think probably in Europe as well, on healthy eating. And that's not necessarily what I mean. I mean, that's an interesting question, how we teach kids about healthy eating. That's a whole separate issue. But in just thinking about how children approach the question of what to eat and what role food plays in their lives, and teaching children how to cook basic dishes and things like that. We used to have something called home economics, where we taught kids how to sew. And I mean, at that point, it was mostly taught to women, but to bring back some kind of food literacy into our schools, I think would be a really interesting approach.
Maybe shifting to quite a big part of your book as well, talking about sort of the ethics sort of discussion. So I mean, maybe to sort of enter into this discussion, you talk about the ethics of eating animals, and then you consider quite a broad range, I guess, of ethical theories. So maybe, I know it's a lot to ask probably, but just give us sort of a playing field of, okay, what sort of ethical theories could we be using to sort of understand this question regarding sort of the ethics of eating animals?
Right. So I mean, typically, we might look at utilitarian views and a focus on animal suffering as the primary wrong. We could also think about animal rights and just the fact that animals die and are killed in order for us to eat them as, the primary wrong, right? So, I mean, it seems to me that one thing that almost everyone can agree on is that large-scale animal agriculture in the form of factory farming is wrong, right? And so you might think, well, if we can agree on that, then aren't we kind of done, right? Well, not exactly, because why we think it's wrong might make a big difference with respect to what we think the solution is, right? So if you really think animal suffering is the primary wrong, well, there have been various proposals to genetically modify animals in certain ways to reduce their suffering, right? And some of this is already done, right? So breeding cattle who don't need to be dehorned, for example, right, saves them the pain of dehorning. Some philosophers have gone further and entertained thoughts about well, what if we could breed decerebrated chickens, right? Chickens who basically have no brains and then can't really suffer. What if we could knock out pain centers in cattle, right? Things like this. Well, if you think the primary wrong of animal agriculture is suffering, then you might be kind of tempted towards those ideas, at least to reduce the amount of suffering we see now. If you think the primary wrong is simply treating animals as ends or as means, right, for our end, and not as treating them as ends in themselves, or not as treating them as living subjects deserving of respect, then you're going to think that those approaches just completely miss the problem, right, and completely miss the point of what's wrong with this system. So I think how we diagnose the wrong does make a difference in terms of thinking about how to remedy it.
And then usually, I guess, these approaches are sort of set out as distinct approaches, all sort of evaluating, okay, what is sort of the wrongdoing and how should we evaluate why it is wrong. But I guess sort of intuitively, my question to you would be is it ultimately, when you sort of think about these questions, that we have to take an aspect which is more about the suffering. We have to take an aspect that is more about the rights, where you slowly put these pieces together. I guess that's always the question, can you put some of these pieces together of these big ethical theories? But maybe in this concrete case, when we think about, right, the ethics of eating animals, that does actually make sense to put some of these pieces together.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's right. I think, we can bring these pieces together. I think there's a lot of reasons why philosophy and food are a great fit for one another. One reason why they might not be is that as philosophers, we tend to look for clear-cut answers where we can reduce things down to a single diagnosis. And that's just not going to be the case with food, right? It's not going to be a single solution. It's not going to be probably a single diagnosis, right? So feminist critiques of eating animals have focused on the way in which the sort of ideology of meat eating is tied up in kind of problematic notions about gender and masculinity and domination. And I think that's also something that is right and that we should be mindful of, right? The ways in which we see meat eating as tied up in certain kinds of ideas about masculinity, and about kind of human domination over animals, about male domination over women, and things like that. So I think, we can also take on board those critiques and think about, again, going back to the question we started with, right? How we think of what food is, how we think about what people should be eating, what it's appropriate for certain people to be eating, and things like that. And then thinking about, the question of our treatment of animals, which is also tied in, of course, to questions about agriculture and how we should approach agriculture more broadly, right? If we move away from eating animals, we're going to be moving towards something else. And what is that something else? And what does it look like, right? As people move more and more towards plant-based foods and we produce more and more soy, how is that produced? And a lot of people want to say, well, look, that's bad too. Of course, it's not a zero-sum game, right? So the fact that, the way that soy is grown, right, might be environmentally problematic doesn't mean that we should go back to eating meat. So I think, realizing that there are any number of values at play here, and that it's going to be difficult to do justice to all of them, but we can still try, I think is important.
No. And then moving maybe to political philosophy, I thought this question is certainly challenging as well. So you raised the question, and I quote, can we justify government interference with people's food choice? And if so, to what extent? What form will the justification take? So that's a big question, I guess. So how are we sort of to address that question, which is like a classical sort of political philosophy question, but now in the case of sort of food choice?
Right. So I think, this is actually ties into the issues we've just been talking about, right? I think that we tend to understand this question as like, look, we're autonomous beings making food choices, and the government is going to come along and limit them, right? And this is how the discourse is often presented to us. But in fact, there's a false assumption in that question, which is that we are currently autonomous with respect to our food choices. And a lot of the things we talked about earlier with respect to food epistemology show that this just isn't the case, right? Our food choices are already being interfered with, right? We don't really determine what foods are available to us. We don't necessarily determine or aren't fully aware of the options we're choosing between, right? Certain foods, we hear a lot of talk about governments subsidizing certain food groups and not others, right? But it's true that, certain foods are more expensive than others. And so it's not like we are making our choices in a completely autonomous, completely like unmessed with way, for lack of a better term, right? There's already a lot of framing, a lot of nudging, a lot of restriction going on in how we choose our foods, from, where we're able to buy food, right, to which foods are made available, which foods are subsidized, which foods are available to people on government assistance programs and things like that, right? So, so I think once we recognize that we're not really as autonomous as we think, right, there's this question about, okay, well, given that, maybe the better question is like, who do we want interfering with our food choices, right? And some people might genuinely think like, I would rather have food corporations than the government, right? Some people really don't trust the government. And, so they might actually say, no, I would rather have McDonald's interfering with my food choices, or General Mills or whatever. Okay, fair enough. As long, I think the first step is just being aware that that's really the choice we're looking at in many cases. And so I guess then a different way of putting it is like, well, who would you rather, when we ask about government interference, notice again, this question of the government is interfering with your food choices puts the focus on you as the consumer, right? That what you eat is up to you, it's your choices, and the responsibility is on you, right? If we shift that focus and we say, well, look, how are these food choices being presented to you? How is food being marketed to you, right? Then I think the question becomes about government interference with, or placing government limits on corporations and on how they're able to market and produce their food and sell it to consumers, and what kind of transparency we should be demanding, what we want to see on labels, what kind of regulation we want. Does that, as far as how to to justify that from a political perspective, I mean, again, the political perspective, asking for justification from a political perspective assumes that this is really a question about limiting freedom. But if we understand it as a question of, we're going to have our freedom is limited, and what is, how do we want to shift those limits, or how do we want those limits presented to us, or what form do we want those limits to take? I think we can also understand it as an epistemic question to some extent, right? About how, not just like it's, how foods are made available or not made available, but what kind of information is made available, right? Because a lot of these questions about government restrictions on food are really questions about information, right? When we talk about mandating calorie counts on labels, right? That's a question about information. Nobody's saying you can't buy this food. We're saying, what kind of information should be presented to consumers. When we talk about marketing junk food to kids, for example, right? So the UK has limits on in what hours you can advertise certain kinds of foods. That's a question about information, right? What information can you present to kids? What information can you make accessible to them? And so, I think that there's an important epistemological dimension to this too. And if we see autonomy as resting on a kind of epistemic access, right, then we'll understand that the political and the epistemic questions are deeply intertwined.
Yeah. That's I guess interesting to emphasize, because I'm sort of imagining the case, right, where you are going to say, no, the government should not sort of limit our food choice, which means, sure, you can choose between these 3 different hamburgers, but one is poisoned, right? Like that would be sort of advocating for, no, even those you shouldn't ban, right? But as soon as you, like, then I guess the epistemic comes in and say, well, how are you going to find that out, right? From your sort of individual sort of epistemic position? Well, you won't. Then the people that are sort of striving towards no government interference are sort of stuck with some sort of very difficult positions for them, their epistemic position, to sort of understand, well, is this really the choice I should be making, right? And if we're very skeptical or like worried about, well, there's so much information there to be processed that, for all sort of practical purposes, you're not going to manage, then, but I'm not sure if that still is like a political justification. I'm not sure.
I mean, the point about poison is actually interesting, because that is really where government regulation of food comes in the first place, right? Is that it used to be that, people were literally getting poisoned by adulteration of food products, right? Of, adulterated milk, adulterated cheese, adulterated meat, right? And then at the beginning of, I guess, the 20th century, you have, Upton Sinclair's book In the Jungle, where he talks about the meat packing industry and some of the practices. And people are really appalled and demand that the government step in to protect them from, harmful, toxic adulteration in the food system, right? And that's really like the primary health concern that government regulation is intended to address. Now, you're right that, there is a worry about people having so much information that they can't possibly process it all. And so I think, one role for the government now is, it seems like it's not just that the foods themselves are adulterated, although of course that is still a problem, right? And the scale of meat recalls alone in this country is staggering. It's like tens of millions of pounds of meat each year being recalled for contamination and, killing people, right? So that food safety is certainly an issue that demands government regulation. But I think also there's this question of government regulation of information and of how information is transmitted to us and how information might be, adulterated in its own way.
That's 2 separate questions, I guess. No, that's really interesting. And then maybe relatedly, sort of on the topic of food justice. So you also raised a question there that I thought was interesting, where you sort of, and I quote, is food justice really a philosophical debate, or is it a matter of engaging in activism until these global goals are achieved? I think that's interesting, because that maybe relates also to what we were talking about, right? Like, is it defensible to eat meat? And if the answer into it is like, no, it's not, right? Like, then all that is left is, okay, let's change people's minds, let's engage in activism. And philosophy stars maybe was there, but not anymore. Like, done the work, now it's up to us. But here the question, like, does philosophy have something important to add to the question, like food justice?
Yeah, and I should say that this is, at that point in the book, I'm talking about a passage from a great philosopher, Paul Thompson, who is also one of the contemporary, like the sort of founders of contemporary philosophy of food, and who has written a lot about agriculture in particular. And anyone who's interested in, he talks about that philosophers have paid a lot of attention to environmental ethics, but in terms of like thinking about the ethics of agricultural practices specifically, it was a relatively underdeveloped area of philosophy of food. And he has a great article called Nature, Politics, and the Philosophy of Agriculture that I highly recommend for anyone who's interested in this. But in this particular passage, which is from his book on food ethics, he's talking about labor practices in the food system, and he describes all of these, exploitative, abusive practices involving food workers. And after he's described this, he says, in some sense, like, this isn't really a philosophical question at all. Like, anybody can read about, slavery in the agricultural system and recognize that that's wrong and recognize that that's unjust. We don't need philosophers to come along and say, hey, it's really unjust to force people to pick tomatoes for like pennies an hour, right? That's wrong. No, we already know that. So he says, in some sense, this is not really a philosophical question at all. We have this ability to recognize injustice, and then the only question is what is to be done about it, right? And likewise, you might wonder, well, is that a philosophical question? What does philosophy really have to contribute here? And I think that that is a very fair point and an interesting point. And I always talk about this with my students when we get to these questions. Like, really, is this a place to be doing philosophy, or is this a place to be doing activism, right? I do think that philosophy has some things we can contribute. I think by, recognizing different dimensions of justice, by recognizing, the role for epistemic justice, for example, in the food system, right? Taking people's agency as knowers, right? As decision makers seriously, and recognizing that there are epistemic dimensions to food justice. I think that can be one kind of philosophical contribution. I think, recognizing different kinds of theories of justice, different dimensions of justice can be another contribution. One thing I talk about in the book is shifting conceptions of what food justice demands, from thinking about food security to thinking about food sovereignty, right? Justice as a matter of just giving people enough food, to giving people a voice in determining what kind of food system they're inhabiting, right? Determining what that food looks like, that food needs to be something that they would choose, that is culturally appropriate, right? Giving communities power over their own food systems. That is a kind of philosophical shift in thinking about justice, right? Justice is something that requires participation rather than just, a kind of one-sided distribution of goods. And so I think that is something philosophy can contribute. But I think this is also a place where philosophers can step back a little bit and say, our theories may not be totally adequate to capturing the task, or we could learn a lot from activists here, or, to step back and sort of say, well, what can we do to help? Right. There are a lot of times where it's easy as philosophers to say, well, here's what a more just food system would look like. Everyone should eat local food. Everyone should eat, food that's produced in a sustainable way. That would be great, right? But clearly that's not happening. And I think, the question of why isn't that happening isn't just a theoretical one. It's not even a question for like empirical moral psychology. It's a practical question, right? Of like, well, what are the actual barriers here? And sometimes what's really helpful in those cases is to listen to farmers, listen to producers, listen to activists working in communities, and pay attention.
And then maybe towards the end of the book, you end your book by stating, and sort of, I quote here, "We want our diets to offer us a way of eating in the most holistic sense, a system of knowledge, value, beauty, health, and justice." So I was reading that, and that sounds a lot packed into that, and a good note to end, to sort of portray the challenge, I guess, that lies ahead. And you, of course, say, right, like many food movements have not lived up to that type of expectation, which, again, is a lot to ask, which actually you acknowledge yourself as well. So when the sort of task is so grand, I guess, like, should we be optimistic about us living up to it? That would be the question.
Yeah. I mean, look, maybe, hearing that read back to me, I think, do we want that? Is that what I want? Is that what everyone? I mean, maybe some people just want to eat a hamburger and not think about it. And, I think, okay, that might be what some people want. And if we really, that might be okay too. And certainly I don't want every single meal that I have to offer a system of knowledge, value, beauty, health, and justice, right? Sometimes I just need to eat something so I can go to sleep and not be hungry. And that's, that is also a real need and a real desire, and that's fine sometimes, right? I think that recognizing that food can do all of these things is important. I think recognizing the dimensions of food that involve and transmit a kind of cultural knowledge. I mean, there are, thousands of years of knowledge that go into some of the dishes that we eat, some of the foods we eat, the way we prepare that food. We are truly a species that evolved out of cooking, right? I mean, it's really at the moment when we start to cook our food and can extract more calories from it, we can expand our brains, we can form language, we can live in bigger communities and start culture. So food is really where culture begins, right? And I think that recognizing that is an important step in recognizing food's potential. And I think that the food systems that we currently have, our industrialized food system, has transformed the planet in a way that nothing else has, right? No other human innovation has, for better and for worse. So yeah, this is a lot to ask, right? Have any of the food movements so far been up to this task? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's too soon to say, right? And I think one thing that's really interesting we're standing at a point in time, I think, where we see different directions that for the food system, right? On the one hand, we see more and more people really interested in eating locally, eating food that's produced from small producers who they can have face-to-face interactions with, people really caring about animal ethics, trying to buy more humanely produced foods, trying to buy more sustainable foods. So that is one route that these things can take. On the other hand, we see people gravitating towards, substitutes for meat and dairy that might be more industrially produced, right? So the same set of values, caring more about sustainability, caring more about suffering and choosing more humane foods, can lead us down two very different paths, right? Towards cultivated meat grown in a lab, towards, industrially produced dairy and meat substitutes, or towards locally produced, like really unprocessed foods. And I think that most people are not necessarily choosing one or the other path, right? Most people are gonna follow both systems. So I think just being open-minded about what form solutions will take, recognizing that this is not going to be, just one path, but also trying to be more informed, trying to hold producers more accountable, I think will play a huge role. And the ability to transmit information and hold food producers and food labels to account, I think is something that we can do as consumers that will have an impact. So I think, demanding kind of top-down change and not expecting consumers to do all the work while simultaneously being willing to do the work that we can, right? And there have been, I think, real gains. And demanding more transparency about labor, about how animals are treated and things like this, and pushing back on, these kinds of attempts to place legal shields between what kind of information consumers can access, right? So these so-called ag-gag laws where you can't go in and take pictures in factory farms, right? Where people can't access certain kinds of information. I've talked about cultivated meat at several points, and there are a lot of ethical arguments for it. In thinking about innovations in the food system, I think we do have to bear in mind, well, what is the kind of epistemic shield that's put up between me and the product as a result of adopting this, right? So we may be put in situations where it looks like something is really ethically promising, but might, further reduce transparency in the food system. And that might be a kind of trade-off that we have to make.
No, that's a lot to think about. So I think that's a great note to end, so we can continue thinking about these questions. And then maybe sort of as a final question that I ask every guest on the series is sort of looking ahead to the philosophy of food, sort of as one area within philosophy. What are some of the exciting questions that you see, maybe from your individual perspective, but then also maybe from the philosophy of food more broadly? Like, that would be interesting to know.
Okay, great. Yeah. So if you can't tell, I'm really interested in food epistemology. I think it's really interesting. I think exploring areas of epistemic injustice in our food system is really interesting. I'm really interested in nutrition. So I think questions about how we have access to or don't have access to information about the nutritional impact of what we eat is really interesting. I think the ways in which we treat individuals as knowledgeable about their own food practices and about their own bodies is really interesting. So Megan Dean, who did a postdoc here at Hamilton and now is at Michigan State, has a paper on like trustworthy eaters, where she talks about how we trust people or not when they report having like certain kinds of food allergies or when they report the choices for their dietary practices. I think this comes up a lot in our discourse about food and health in this country. Like we treat certain people's reports of what they're eating as just inherently untrustworthy, right? And we don't put a lot of trust in eaters in this country. And I think that's a really interesting question. I think there are really interesting issues about, you know, how we're going to shift our diets, what kinds of things we'll start to consider eating. Insects, will insects be a food source? How will cultivated meat and the access to it play out? Will we start to treat it just the same as factory farm meat, just the same as local meat, or will we not, right? Should we treat it that way? What kind of labels do we want to put on it? I think that's a really interesting question. As far as philosophy of food more generally, I think there's some really interesting work being done in food aesthetics. You know, we talked a little bit about whether food can be art, but I think more and more food aesthetics is moving away from that question and seeing that question as just not the most interesting question we can ask. It's certainly, as you point out, a question we inherit from the history of philosophy and the history of aesthetics. But I think more and more people are asking, forget the food as art question. Let's look at questions about, you know, well, what kind of aesthetic properties does food have, right? And as we look more and more at like, you know, certain kinds of embodied aesthetics, the way that like our entire physical bodies play a role in aesthetic experience, I think there's more and more room to think about new dimensions of food aesthetics. So I think there's just so much interesting work being done. And thank you for having me on. And thanks for interviewing other philosophers in this area and drawing attention to it.